What if entire first floors across America were never meant to be seen again? Not demolished, not renovated, buried. After 1890, something strange appears in photographs from cities across the United States. Chicago, Seattle, San Francisco, New York, Boston, Denver, St. Louis. Buildings with windows disappearing below street level. Doorways cut in half by rising sidewalks. Stone arches submerged in dirt. Why would fully functional ground floors suddenly become basements? Official explanations exist. Street grading, urban modernization, sewer upgrades, raising cities above flood zones. But if that's the whole story, why does the pattern repeat in cities with completely different climates, terrains, and infrastructure problems? And why does it seem to happen within a surprisingly narrow time frame? In the decades after 1890, photographs show workers digging out what appear to be buried lower levels of buildings that were clearly designed as primary entrances. Large windows, ornate stone framing, decorative ironwork, symmetrical storefront designs. These were not basements. Basements do not receive decorative arches. Basements are not built with grand staircases descending into darkness. So why were these spaces underground? At first glance, the answer seems simple. Cities raised their street levels to accommodate growth. But here is the first contradiction. If streets were raised, why do many buildings show no visible modification to accommodate that change? In numerous examples, the original lower doors remain intact, just sealed. Windows remain in place, just buried. Wouldn't architects redesign facades to match the new grade? Unless the change happened faster than the redesign, or unless the redesign was never the goal. Another contradiction emerges when examining city planning documents. In some cities, records of major street elevation projects are detailed and well preserved. In others, documentation is surprisingly thin. Entire districts appear elevated without comprehensive engineering reports surviving. Urban projects leave paper trails, funding allocations, engineering diagrams, public notices. Yet in certain cases, photographs reveal dramatic changes without equally dramatic documentation. Was it oversight or something else? Consider Seattle. The official narrative states that after the Great Fire of 1889, the city rebuilt at a higher street level to improve drainage. That explanation appears logical. Yet underground tours today reveal entire preserved storefronts beneath modern sidewalks, finished shops, glass display windows, architectural detailing that seems too refined to be merely discarded infrastructure. If elevation was purely functional, why were these lower levels not demolished instead of entombed intact? Why build new streets above old ones rather than remove the old entirely? Demolition was common practice even then. So why bury instead of clear? Now examine Chicago. After the Great Fire of 1871, rebuilding efforts were massive. Street grading occurred in stages, but photographs from the 1890s show multiple buildings across districts with lower floors partially submerged. Some appear to have been constructed with entrances at a lower grade than adjacent sidewalks already suggest. Were architects miscalculating street heights? Or were streets changing repeatedly? If so, what necessitated such continual elevation? Flood control is one answer, but many affected cities were not flood-prone. Denver, for example, displays similar buried lower floors despite being far from coastal surges. Why would an inland city replicate the same architectural burial pattern? And then there is San Francisco. Before the 1906 earthquake, images already show partially buried structures. After reconstruction, similar patterns persist. If rebuilding provided opportunity to reset grades cleanly, why do buried first floors continue appearing? Another contradiction arises when examining window design. In many cases, buried lower floors feature tall, evenly spaced windows designed for display or light. Basement windows are typically small and utilitarian, yet these submerged windows resemble main-level commercial facades. Why design ornate commercial fronts only to bury them? Were they intentionally repurposed, or were they once fully exposed? Look closely at staircases. Numerous historic photographs show stairs descending from street level into what appear to be former ground floors. If those floors were originally basements, why would primary entrances descend rather than ascend? Urban design favors elevation above street runoff, not below. Descending entrances increase water risk, unless the street rose after construction. But if that happened gradually, where are the transitional phases? Why do photographs often jump from normal grade to fully buried without clear intermediate stages? Some historians argue that cities frequently regraded streets to improve sewage and drainage systems. This explanation accounts for certain cases. But it introduces another question. Why do buried floors often feature architectural styles predating the supposed street raise by only a few years? In some instances, buildings constructed in the 1880s appear partially buried by the mid-1890s. Would investors design expensive stone facades without awareness of imminent grade changes? City planners typically announce large-scale grading well in advance, unless those grading decisions were reactive. Reactive to what? Mud accumulation? Flooding? Infrastructure collapse? If entire districts required sudden elevation, what triggered that necessity? Consider photographic evidence from St. Louis. Images from the late 19th century show workers excavating soil from around lower building levels, as though attempting to restore access. If burial was intentional and beneficial, why reverse it? Why dig back down? In New York, certain brownstones display steps leading upward from street level today. But earlier images suggest lower facades were once closer to grade. Did sidewalks rise gradually? If so, what drove that consistent upward trend across cities? Urban growth alone does not naturally raise ground level by several feet in such a short period. Debris accumulation can raise streets slowly over centuries, but these changes occurred within decades. Another contradiction emerges in architectural symmetry. Many buried floors align perfectly with upper stories in window spacing and decorative elements. So if the lower level were originally intended as basement, proportions would differ. Yet proportions match, suggesting they were designed as primary floors. So why are they now subterranean? Official accounts attribute some burial to transportation upgrades. Rail lines, trolley systems, expanded roads. But expanding transportation typically lowers streets through cutting, not raising them. Lowering reduces incline strain. Raising requires massive material input. Where did the fill come from? Urban fill must be sourced. Excavated soil from nearby projects? If so, records of material relocation should exist. In some cities, they do. In others, silence. And then there is the matter of consistency. Why does this pattern appear nationwide? Different municipalities, different engineers, different climates, yet similar results. On windows buried, entrances sealed, stairs added downward. Coincidence repeated across the continent becomes pattern. Pattern without centralized coordination becomes anomaly. Another contradiction involves underground infrastructure discovered later. When 20th century subway systems were installed, Crews sometimes encountered older utility lines at unexpected depths, pipes and conduits deeper than anticipated. Were those lines installed before or after street elevation? If after, why place them so deep? If before, what was ground level at installation? In Boston, certain historic districts reveal storefronts beneath current sidewalks that show no signs of water damage consistent with long-term basement usage. Plaster intact, stone clean. If they functioned as basements for decades, moisture would likely leave marks. Instead, some appear abruptly entombed. Why no gradual degradation? Another anomaly lies in city directories. Business listings from certain years place shops at addresses that today correspond to basement-level entrances. Did those businesses operate below grade, or was grade different at the time? Maps from the era sometimes show slight variations in street heights, but rarely dramatic ones. Cartography typically records major elevation projects, yet comprehensive elevation maps for some cities remain elusive. Consider the labor required to raise streets by several feet across entire districts, horse-drawn wagons moving soil, manual leveling, retaining walls. It would be visible in newspapers, a massive civic undertaking. Yet many newspapers of the era mention only routine grading, not widespread burial of functional floors. Why such limited coverage? Was it considered mundane, or was something more abrupt occurring? Another contradiction emerges in foundation depth. Modern engineers examining historic buildings sometimes note unusually deep foundations for structures of that period. Why build foundations deeper than necessary? Unless original ground level was lower. If original ground level was lower, then current street height represents added mass. Added when? And why? Some propose that rapid urbanization required raising streets to combat sanitation issues. 19th century cities struggled with waste management. Raising streets allowed installation of modern sewer lines. Logical. Yet that still does not explain the ornamental quality of buried levels. Why invest in decoration for a floor likely to become obsolete, unless its burial was not anticipated? In some cities, layers of compacted soil beneath raised streets contain mixed debris, brick fragments, ash, household waste. But beneath that debris, intact stone facades remain. If burial was planned, why not remove facades to salvage material? Stone was valuable. Demolition materials were reused. Entombing usable stone contradicts economic logic. Another contradiction appears in photographic timing. Many images documenting buried floors cluster between 1890 and 1910. Why this period? Industrial expansion began earlier. Why not see similar widespread burial in the 1850s? Why not continue heavily into the 1920s? Why that narrow window? Coinciding events include rapid industrialization, massive immigration, infrastructure modernization. But those factors vary regionally. Yet burial patterns appear nationally. Some researchers note similarities to European cities where catastrophic fires or floods prompted rebuilding above debris layers. However, American cities displaying buried floors often lack documented catastrophes severe enough to deposit uniform layers of soil. Without catastrophe, why uniformity? Examine staircases again. Descending stairs added after burial are often narrow and utilitarian compared to the grand lower facades they lead to. This suggests retrofitting. But retrofitting implies original design did not anticipate burial. So what forced retrofit? Another anomaly involves building permits. Certain archival permits show renovations to basement entrances that correspond to former primary doors. Terminology shifts. What was once first floor becomes basement. Language adjusts to match new reality. When language changes, perception changes. but the stone remains unchanged. In some cases, buried lower floors later become speakeasies during Prohibition, hidden by elevation, conveniently concealed. But that is decades after initial burial. Their concealment was opportunistic, not original intent. So concealment preceded their new use. Why were so many cities simultaneously altering vertical ground relationships? Natural sedimentation does not operate on coordinated timelines. Human action does. But coordinated human action across independent municipalities suggests shared motivation. Was it purely modernization, or was modernization responding to something else? Some late 19th century accounts reference unusually heavy mud flows in certain regions. Localized, not nationwide. Yet mud deposition sufficient to bury multiple feet of structure would leave geological evidence. Where is that evidence cataloged? Soil analysis from beneath raised streets sometimes reveals layered fill rather than natural sediment. This supports intentional elevation. But intentional elevation still demands reason, and reason still requires documentation. Why are some records detailed while others remain sparse? Another contradiction appears in property boundaries. If street grade rises, property owners must adjust entrances, staircases, and sometimes entire facades. Such modifications cost money. Were property owners compensated? Some records show assessments for grading improvements. Others show none. Did owners accept burial quietly, or was resistance minimal? And if resistance was minimal, why? Was benefit so clear, or was choice limited? Look at architectural drawings from the era. Some buildings constructed after 1890 already feature elevated entrances with substantial staircases leading upward. Were architects anticipating rising streets, or were they responding to recent burial events? If responding, what prompted such widespread architectural adaptation? The timeline remains uneven. In some cities, buried floors appear before major sewer installations. In others, after. Cause and effect blur. If sewer upgrades required elevation, why do some upgraded cities lack buried facades? Selective application complicates uniform explanation. Then there is the visual strangeness. Photographs show entire rows of buildings with their lower third swallowed by earth, uniformly, as though a horizontal line swept across the district. If grading were gradual, one might expect variation. Yet uniformity appears common. Uniformity implies coordinated effort. Coordinated effort implies planning. Planning implies documentation. Documentation implies transparency. Yet transparency is inconsistent. Another contradiction lies in the economic logic of land use. Urban land in the 1890s was increasingly valuable. Burying usable square footage reduces revenue, unless new square footage above compensates. But raising streets does not add floors. It simply shifts them. Why voluntarily reduce accessible space, unless inaccessible space was unavoidable? Some speculate that health crises prompted radical sanitation measures. Cholera outbreaks earlier in the century forced cities to rethink drainage. But cholera peaked decades before widespread burial patterns. Timing misaligns. Others point to technological optimism. Cities racing toward modernity sometimes embraced dramatic transformation, but transformation usually seeks efficiency. Burial without demolition seems inefficient. Another question lingers. Why do some buried floors show no signs of wear consistent with long-term use before burial? If they operated as storefronts for decades, floors would show heavy traffic erosion. In certain excavated examples, surfaces appear surprisingly preserved. Was their active lifespan shorter than assumed? Were they ever fully used? Or were they buried soon after completion? If buried soon after completion, what changed so quickly? Building codes? Engineering miscalculations? Environmental shifts? In Denver, historical photographs reveal regrading projects that elevated entire intersections. Yet similar burial appears in areas without documented grade change. Is our documentation incomplete? Or our interpretation? Consider the psychological aspect. A generation builds ornate street-level facades. The next generation buries them. Would there not be commentary, debate, public resistance? Yet newspapers often frame grading as improvement without acknowledging loss of functional architecture. Was it seen as necessary sacrifice, or was it less noticeable in real time than it appears retrospectively? When viewed in isolation, each city offers plausible explanation. Flood control here, fire rebuilding there, sewer upgrade elsewhere. But when viewed collectively, patterns align too neatly. Alignment across independent events suggests underlying similarity. Similarity without shared cause invites deeper inquiry. And yet, definitive proof of a singular cause remains elusive. So we return to the image. Rows of stone arches swallowed by dirt, windows reduced to basement vents, staircases leading downward where once customers walked straight in. If modernization required elevation, why are some districts still showing partially buried facades over a century later? Why were they never fully integrated into new design? Why leave architectural ghosts visible? Perhaps because removing them would require confronting the full scale of alteration. Or perhaps because the buried layers serve as foundation, both physically and historically. Whatever occurred after 1890 reshaped vertical perception in American cities. Ground level shifted, language shifted, memory shifted. But stone did not shift itself. Someone moved the earth. Someone decided first floors would become basements. Someone approved budgets. Someone signed permits. And yet, across the nation, the reasoning dissolves into localized explanations that never quite converge. If street raising was purely practical, why does its evidence feel incomplete? If burial was inevitable, why does it appear so coordinated? If modernization demanded it, why do some cities escape the pattern entirely? Perhaps the answers are mundane. Perhaps urban growth simply required dramatic measures. Or perhaps the uniformity hints at a broader event not fully acknowledged. What exactly happened to America's first floors after 1890? Why do so many remain hidden beneath our sidewalks? And if ground level once stood several feet lower across entire districts, what else might still be beneath our streets? No single document provides a definitive explanation. No unified theory resolves every contradiction. Only images remain. Stone arches under asphalt, windows beneath pavement, doorways leading nowhere, entire floors resting silently below our feet, buried not by time alone, but by decision. Whether that decision was practical, reactive, or something less discussed remains uncertain. The buildings endure, the soil remains, the pattern persists. And beneath nearly every major American city, there are steps that go down to a level that was once, unquestionably, the ground.